I bought not with riches, neither silver nor gold, but Christ hath redeemed me. I'm safe in His fold, in the book of His kingdom, with His pages so fair, through Jesus my Savior. My name is written there. My name is written there, on the page wide and fair, in the book of God's kingdom. My name is written there.
This evening, as we go back to Acts chapter 7, we're going to be looking at verses 17, 18, and 19. And remember what's going on is Stephen is giving this long dissertation, and it is long. It's most of the entire chapter, chapter 7, to prove that he was one of them, and to go against the accusations that they brought against him, and that he was not guilty. And we see what the result was. They still ended up stoning him. But he was not afraid. In verse 17 it said, "But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. The same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children, to the end they might not live." The fear of the Egyptians, especially when they saw the Hebrew people growing and becoming stronger, such a strong sense of family, faith, and everything else, they were afraid. The Egyptians were afraid. Now, some have said, some theologians say, and I think I tend to agree with the first, that the name of the Pharaoh at this time was Ramesses II, who ruled from 1301 to 1234. And remember, that BC time, that the years went backwards. Okay? They went backwards up until the time of Christ, and then after that it started going forward where we are today. The other was Thutmose the first, who ruled from 1528 to 1508, which would have been several years before Ramesses. The reason why is because in the reading in the book of Genesis, when they were building, they built two cities. They made brick. This was part of their hard labor in the last 200 years that they were there, 200 and some plus years. They made brick and they built cities, and they built two cities, and one of the cities' names was Ramesses. And that's kind of why I think I'm more in line with thinking that the name of this Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh that cruelly mistreated them, was Ramesses II, because usually when a city is built, it's named after someone who is in power or authority. So it was named, I think it was named after Ramesses, who was Pharaoh at the time. Now, I could be wrong, and it doesn't, I mean, you can study your history, you can surmise and say, and I don't know that you can ever come up with a definite answer as to exactly who it was. But suffice it to say, it's not the same Pharaoh that was over Joseph. Because he did not regard Joseph. He did not regard what Joseph had done. So that's where we find the people. But at the onset of the 400 years, or 400 plus years, they were pretty well at peace, and they were increasing. They were doing exactly what God had told them to. The wonderful increase of the people of Israel in Egypt and this was all prophesied about them in the book of Genesis, it was by a wonder of providence that in the little time they advanced from a family into a nation. You remember some 70 to 75 people who went in. It was when the time of the promise drew nigh, the time when they were to be formed into a people. During the first 215 years after the promise made to Abraham, the children of the covenant were increased but to 70. But in the latter 200 years, 215 years, they increased to 600,000 fighting men. That's fighting men. I don't know exactly what the age there is for fighting men, but 600,000 fighting men. Now that's besides women and children. And please understand, this was just a custom in the Old Testament, and even in the first of the New Testament, the men were the only ones counted. It's not saying they're the only ones that were important. It's just that they were the only ones that were counted most of the time. And so 600,000 fighting men and 600,000, what is that? 600,000 is that 1,000,002? 1,000,002, and say everybody had 2 kids? That's quite a few, isn't it? I know back in the 80s, y'all remember the 80s? Anybody here remember the 80s? I remember sitting in Sunday school somewhere back in the 80s, and the study was in Genesis, and whoever the teacher was said that when Israel left Egypt, it was like the whole state of Arkansas getting up and leaving. Which is probably not far-fetched. Now we're talking about the whole state. Everybody that lives in the state. That's men, women, children, livestock. That's everything, just getting up and moving. So it was quite an undertaking. And it took some time to move that many people, especially. They didn't have 18-wheelers to load everything up in. They didn't have all of these modern conveniences that we have today to be able to move. They didn't have a ship at the time to go across the Red Sea. A lot of people have said, well, where they did, and the Red Sea, if you really look in the Hebrew, it's called the Reed Sea, and R-E-E-D, and there are people that say when they crossed the Red Sea that the water was only knee deep. No. Where they crossed was very deep. It says the walls of water were up on each side. And you remember what happened after they crossed? Pharaoh and all of his army came into the Red Sea, and the waters came back together and covered up the horse and the rider. If you look in the book of Psalms, the horse and the rider drowned in the Red Sea. So it was a very deep thing. And God caused the waters to separate, and they didn't slop through mud. It says they walked across on dry ground. God made all of that happen. He did. He made all of that happen. So, all of these people moving, and you can think about all of the animals that they had with them. They couldn't go over to the 7-Eleven. They couldn't go down to the local grocery store and buy milk and everything else. God provided everything they needed, but they still had things. But God was providing that. As a matter of fact, where did they get the silver and the gold? Where did they get all of the silver and the gold when they got to the foot of the mountain and Moses went up on the mountain to receive the law, and they came to Aaron and said, fashion us a god that we may worship him. And they fashioned the golden calf. They melted down all of the silver and the metal, all of the gold. It was from where God, in the book of Exodus, allowed them to go to Ramesses and take all of the treasure with them. And a lot of this belonged to them anyway. And he allowed them to take that, and so that's how in the world that they had all of this silver and this gold, because otherwise they would have had nothing. And they were going to the promised land, and God was providing food for them every day. He provided water for them, even though Moses didn't know exactly how the second time to bring that about and disobeyed God. But God provided everything for them. All they had to do was walk out and pick it up. I guess they had home delivery wherever they were. Out in the middle of the desert, and there's food right there. They didn't have to go chasing after rabbits. They didn't have to go chasing after this. He made the manna. The manna came down, and they had everything that they needed. You know, so many people underestimate our needs being met. And they take for granted our needs being met. But you take people that don't know where their next meal is coming from, it's a whole different story. And we've got lots of people out there, even in here in the United States, that don't know exactly where their next meal is coming from. There's a lot of children in our nation that a lot of times go to bed hungry with nothing to eat. We have organizations called Feed America's Children or whatever it is. And I think it's a great and wonderful thing. But in the land of plenty that we live in, and there are people that are living on the streets, we have the number of homeless people in America is astounding. The people who have nothing, and everybody has a story. And usually it's a story where they had a lot and they lost everything. You know, one guy says that he was a business owner and all of a sudden everything collapsed. He lost his family, he lost his business, everything else. My grandpa encountered a man back in the 60s, if you can remember that far back. We had a Trailways, you remember Trailways buses? There was a Trailways bus station in a little local restaurant there in my hometown. And my grandpa, I don't know what he was doing. He'd probably getting a cup of coffee. Anyway, he encountered this man and they started talking. And this man had been on a trip with his family. And there had been a tragic car accident. He lost all of his family. And he was trying to get back to his home. I think it was in California or somewhere. And he didn't have enough money. He didn't have enough money. And he told my grandpa this story, and he even gave him, references that he could check to see to make sure his story was all legit and everything else. My grandpa bought him something to eat and paid for his ticket all the way to wherever he lived. And people say, how in the world can things like that happen? Sometimes they happen and you're not planning on it happening. Just like that lady at the restaurant last week. She didn't plan on getting choked. Did y'all hear anything about her? I haven't seen anything on the news or anything. She didn't plan on going to Western Sizzling and taking one bite and then choking and not being able to breathe and having to be taken away in an ambulance. But things do happen. You don't plan those things. They just happen. But this man was down on his luck. It's not like he was holding his hand out, begging or anything, but he was just conversing with my grandpa, and my grandpa decided to help him out. And that's a great and a wonderful thing to be able to do that. I still read stories about people who are in grocery lines and they get to the line and their card is declined. I was reading one today and they asked this man to step to the side because his card kept getting declined, and this woman behind said, I've got it. Paid his $92 food bill. And $92 don't buy that much anymore. You remember when you could go to the grocery store and if you got $10 worth of groceries, you had a big sack full of groceries? Not anymore. I don't know if that even gets you a bag full in Walmart, depending on what you got. Maybe styrofoam balls or something. That's about it. And it's really sad. But that's the way things are. It was in Egypt where they were oppressed and ruled with rigor, when their lives were made so bitter to them that one would think they should have wished to be written childless. Yet they married in faith that God in due time would visit them. They kept doing exactly what God told them to do. They were multiplying. This is how God grew a nation in 400 years. And let me tell you, if anybody can do it, God can. And despite all of this, and you know it has been said by lots of people, and even people in modern times, that the New Testament church has really flourished in times of persecution, in times of hardship. When things are going easy, when things are going good, it's kind of like the old guy said, you don't miss, when you're, how did he put it? You don't miss water until the well runs dry. You just take it for granted. You go there and the faucet and the water's going to come out. If you're on well water, sometimes the well goes dry and you ain't got no water. You know, I know Jerry Blackshears and them haul water up to their place all of the time. And there's a lot of people who do that. Either because the wells are going to have to be too deep, it's too expensive, I don't know. Or sometimes the water's no good, wherever they might be. But you just think about that. You don't think about water until the well's dry. And the necessity of water. And it's just one of those things. But in the land of Goshen, where Joseph put them, was a very fertile land. It was in between two branches of the Nile River. How many heads did the Nile River have? Anybody? 7. Do you know the only 2 rivers that run north? Do you know those? The Nile is one of them. You know what the other one is? That runs north.
Mississippi.
Nope. The Tennessee. The Tennessee River runs north. The only 2 known rivers this side of the equator that flow north instead of south. Because everything gravitates toward the equator or to the south. But the 2 rivers. And it's just amazing how that God was able to do all of these things. Well, not really, because He's the one that created everything. He could have gone boom, if you want to believe in the Big Bang Theory. He could have gone boom, there's a nation. Somebody was teaching a Sunday school class, and the little boy, and they were saying something about the Big Bang Theory. And the little boy says, well, I believe in the Big Bang Theory. And the teacher asked him to explain it. He said, it's simple. God went boom, and there it was. All of a sudden. That's a good explanation. That's a whole lot better than thinking matter was flowing through space or whatever however you get it. I don't know. Is that Darwin? Was it Darwin? Darwin's theory? And you know they still refer to it as Darwin's theory, although they almost teach it as fact. Do you know there are still people today that are going back to the age-old debate that was going on when Columbus was around? There are some people today that are advocating that the world's really flat. In the days of Columbus, they were afraid to sail too far away from known land because they were afraid they would fall off the earth. They thought it was flat. Even though it's been proven that it is round. Even Josiah, when he was 3 years old, said the ball of earth. That's how he described the earth, the ball of earth. We understand that. And I believe if you look across the horizon on certain highways, especially if you go out into Colorado, you can see and you know that the world is a sphere. It is not flat. It is round. And all of the photos that we have back from space kind of bear this out too. And even being able to see the continents from space. And you know, one of the things that a lot of satellites will pick up, and you never really stop to think about it, but you know one thing that it picks up in Asia or over in that region? The Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China. It picks up in space. That's amazing. I've never seen the Great Wall of China. I've heard about it. I've seen pictures of it. But the Great Wall of China. Now, China built a wall. Why can't the United States build a wall? You know, think about it. They've had a wall for centuries. Why can't we build one wall down on the southern border? I don't know. The extreme hardships that they underwent. When the Egyptians observed them to increase in number, they increased their burdens. The more the people came, the more burdens they laid on them. Another reason why I think that they really didn't want them to go is because the Hebrew people had become the working force. Slave labor. They had become the working force in Egypt. And a lot of the Egyptians were not having to work or work as hard because they had the Hebrew people there to do it. So they became taskmasters. Remember, that's who Moses got upset with and killed? Was one of the taskmasters who was cruelly mistreating some of his people. Yeah, that's why he fled. I don't know. We'll probably be covering that in the next week or so. Because that's going to be part of what Stephen talks about too, is Moses. But the workforce basically left. It left the Egyptians to have to get out and do manual labor. You know, there's lots of speculation about actually who does most of the work in the land in which we live. But suffice it to say, somebody has to be out there on the street. Somebody has to be in the plant. Somebody has to be here. Somebody has to be there. And a lot of people who have quit their jobs because of the pandemic, a lot of people who have quit their jobs so they can draw more unemployment. And I've had people tell me during 2020 that they actually quit their job just so they could draw that $600 a week. But that $600 a week stopped. Somebody asked the question, do we really have that many jobs available? And this was a reporter from Tennessee. He said, because there are all kinds of signs out there that says help wanted. And said, I know lots of people who have filled out application after application after application everywhere and have not been hired. And he surmises that it goes back to some kind of technological thing where the applications are viewed more by a computer than anything else. And there are catchphrases or words in there that if it doesn't match, it just kicks it out. You know anything about that, Michael?
A little bit.
A little bit? Is that what happened to you? You said the right thing. But we rely so heavily on technology. And technology is not always the best. And you just can't improve on the human-to-human conversation. You don't really know the person. You're allowing a computer to get to know this person or to hire this person or whatever, however it goes. But it's the fact that maybe they're so short-handed they don't have time to really hire and train people. And we have a lot of automated stuff too, don't we? A lot of automated stuff. Who was it? John Henry? Was it John Henry that wore himself out trying to prove that he could drive more railroad spikes than the machine they created? Yeah. Jacob and Parker know that. Nobody else shook their head. I figured Rick probably knew John Henry. John Henry, the story of John Henry. Wore himself out trying to prove he was quite a powerhouse. And how many during the Industrial Revolution? Did you know basically up until 1800 it was horse and buggy? And from 1800 until now it has done nothing but progress. Automation. And now we have computer automation, digital, and everything else. Being able to do things we never thought we would be able to do. But they didn't have that. It was hard manual labor. How many have any idea what it takes to make brick? And I don't know if the brick that they made, if they fired them in an oven. But really to make brick, you have to have a hot oven. I don't know if you've ever been to one of the brick plants. I guess the one here in Fort Smith is closing up. The Acme Brick. I guess the original one in Malvern is about the only one left in the state of Arkansas, which I think is sad. But they have to fire those bricks. They have to put them in a hot oven. So you can imagine the task that they had. And it was all by hand. There were no machines to do anything. And so the more the people increased, the more the taskmasters put on them. And wanted them to do more and more and more and more. And what were they getting in return? What were they getting in return? They got to keep very little of what they raised. It was so corrupt that they were just wishing that they were childless, so that their children would not have to live through it. And it got to the point where the Egyptian government, the king, the Pharaoh, whatever, were so afraid that these people were going to increase in number, and then they were going to join together with one of their enemies and come and overthrow the powers in Egypt. That was one of their greatest fears. And what was the greatest fear of the Pharisees in the days of Jesus? They accused the Apostle Paul of turning the world upside down, where they accused Jesus of the very same thing. And John the Baptist came on the scene preaching, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." They were saying that all of these were turning the world upside down. In other words, they were upsetting the apple cart. The Pharisees had everything right where they wanted it. They had the people right where they wanted them. And they were using the law that was given to them that was supposed to bring honor and glory to God, but it was bringing more honor and glory to the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, than anybody else. It was lifting up the scribes. It was lifting up the Pharisees. And by the way, I don't think Phariseeism is dead. I think it's very much alive. Their hellish craft and policy. They dealt subtly with our kindred. They were sly. They said, "Come on." They deceived them. Said they, "Let us deal wisely," thinking thereby to secure themselves. But it proved dealing foolishly, for they did but treasure up wrath by it. They resented the very fact of even being in Egypt. And you can imagine, 215 years basically, everything was pretty good. Does it sound like anything else? And then the next 215 whatever plus years was nothing but torture. Does it sound relative to anything else in the Bible? The Great Tribulation, doesn't it? 3.5 years. That's 3.5 years, or 3.5 weeks of years. Everything's going to be peaceful. And then after that, everything is going to turn upside down, literally. It's in the book of Revelation. The barbarous and inhuman cruelty that they might eventually expirate them, They cast out their young children to the end they might not live. The killing of their infant seed seemed a very likely way to crush an infant nation. And what happened? What happened right before? What was happening when Moses was born? They said, kill every male child. And this happened once again too, didn't it? Isn't it amazing how a lot of these things were so similar? Every male child 3 years and under was to be killed in Egypt. And the same rule was by another king thousands of years later, or at least hundreds of years later, who said every male child under the age of 3 be killed, trying to exterminate this one they called Jesus, trying to get rid of him. But remember what God told Joseph and Mary? Take your child and go. Where'd they go? To Egypt. They went to a place of safety. When the kings, the 3 kings, came to view the child, he was already at least 2 years old. Yeah. He was at least 2 years old. And they were living in a house. It wasn't in a manger. They were living in a dwelling. But it wasn't until later that he was allowed to come back, that they were allowed to come back. This was God's way of protecting him. And God had a way of protecting Moses too, didn't he? He sure did. Pharaoh's daughter found him hidden in the bulrushes, the reed type things in the edge of the Nile River, because most of them were to be taken out there and drowned. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine that like I can't imagine women aborting babies today. I just cannot imagine that. You take all these little kids and you just take them off into the river and you drown them. We think things are barbaric now. They've been barbaric for years. Evil is everywhere. It rears its ugly head in mighty ways, different times in history. Can you imagine? But God made a way, and Pharaoh's daughter took him, and he basically became a son of Pharaoh, and he was raised in Pharaoh's house. But also, who did she get to take care of him? His mother, one of the Hebrew women, and it happened to be Moses' mother. So Moses had a dual education. He had an Egyptian education and a Hebrew education. He was a very intelligent man. He was very well liked. And he was called the son of Pharaoh. He was very well versed in all of the things that the Egyptians did, all of the many gods that they worshiped. But he held to who he really was.